Hey there, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business, as we take a look at motivation in our third of three lectures. So this is a continuation of the topic that we covered in the previous two, but now we take a look at a couple of contemporary theories and a way of looking forward as we consider leadership and motivation. The first theory we want to take a look at today is, as you can see on the slide there, the expectancy theory, which essentially suggests that people at work are motivated toward rewards that they want and that they believe they have a reasonable chance of obtaining. And you sort of see there in this graphic borrowed from your textbook, right, that people are constantly making an assessment of how much individual effort to actually put in. And depending upon their skills, their talents, as well as resources given to them by the organization, that effort will combine with those resources to result in individual performance. That performance then ends up getting rewarded in some way, shape, or form by the organization. And those rewards from the organization may or may not necessarily correlate in some satisfying way with that person's personal goals. And so you should see there the chain, the logical chain, as a person makes a day-to-day, perhaps even moment-to-moment decision about how much individual effort to contribute. Essentially, the idea here is that the rewards that are offered to people in order to motivate them and drive them and pull them to give their very best at work has to at least meet two criteria. It has to be rewards, they have to be rewards that they actually want and that they actually believe they have a chance of obtaining. Now, there's a very easy illustration of the difference between these two things, right? So just think for a moment, when was the last time that you went and played the California lottery? Many of us used to play the lottery, perhaps on a regular basis, and many of us do not play the California lottery anymore. And ask yourself, why is it, if you fall into that category, that you don't really play the lottery anymore? Certainly it's not because, well, you know, I became independently wealthy and I no longer need $450 million in prize money. That's probably not why you stopped playing the lottery. Rather, you stopped playing the lottery because, well, while you would have liked to have won the $450 million, you believe you do not have a reasonable chance of obtaining it. In fact, there are many who call the lottery the fool's tax. It's a tax paid by fools who still believe they have a chance of winning. So, in that light, that's one way to illustrate that you can want something and still not believe you have a chance of obtaining it, and therefore your effort is dulled in actually trying to work towards it. There is one other principle that comes out of expectancy theory, which is interesting to note, and that is at the very first juncture, you'll notice back in this diagram on the screen, you see that a person is making their decision how much effort to put out. But the effort they put out is not necessarily directly attached. It's not the only thing that results in individual performance. Someone may want to try as hard as they can, but they're simply not as talented, perhaps, as the person next to them. Or they may have less experience. Or in a particular setting, the organization may not give them all of the resources that they actually need in order to obtain that higher level of performance. For several different reasons, individual effort doesn't always lead to the same level of individual performance. It is one other thing to consider as we take a look at the expectancy theory. Now, that being said, the second theory that we want to take a look at here is the equity theory. And as you look at it on the screen there, the equity theory is defined as people evaluate their treatment by the organization relative to the treatment of others in the organization, and they may choose to adjust their level of input based on their perception of fair outcomes. Now, I realize that can be a bit of a word salad, But essentially, look at the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen. And so what is going on here is that someone is looking at what their outcomes are. And for many people, when they first graduate college, they look at how the organization treats them, the rewards that they get, and they believe that that's relatively equal to being a complete newcomer in the firm. And so they say, okay, well, that's fair. I'm only getting what should be given to a newcomer, right? However, if you compare, you see result 2, right? You see that a newcomer is actually getting better and higher rewards than you are getting. You may say, well, wait a minute. I'm putting in all of these inputs, but I'm not getting the same outcomes. That's not fair. Or you may say, hey, this is very interesting. This is result 3. I am just doing my average level best, and I'm getting way better outcomes than this other person who was just hired on. That doesn't seem fair either. I benefit, but that doesn't seem fair. Well, essentially, sort of the math of this is in the next slide. And by the way, the next slide is not in your textbook, but this helps to explain the equity theory a little bit better. So you see in the slide I'm giving you here, the equity theory, an individual's belief that the treatment the individual receives is fair relative to the treatment received by others. Sometimes what I call this is the looking over your shoulder theory, right? Because everybody loves to look over the shoulder of the next person and see what are they getting, right? And so the assumption of the equity theory is essentially this, that people are motivated to seek social equity in the rewards they receive for performance. They believe, all other things being equal, that people should be treated fairly for the level of input that they're giving, right? And so you sort of see the math there. Individuals view the value of the rewards, the outcomes, and the inputs of efforts as ratios, and they make a subjective comparison of their inputs and outcomes to the other person's inputs and outcomes. Now, a very easy illustration of this, of course, is that we just had a midterm exam. And if you're honest, you might be able to sort of mentally aggregate how many hours that you spent studying for that midterm exam. Now, if you have a friend in the class or perhaps your neighbor and you were to compare notes and find out, wait a minute, I studied twice as long as my friend did and we both got the same grade. How is that, right? You would make an assessment, an internal assessment of how fair that is and whether or not for the same amount of effort, why do we get different outcomes? Well, in those kinds of situations, right, where you're looking sort of over another person's shoulder to see, well, based on similar level of input, what are their outcomes? Then this next slide sort of demonstrates some of the decisions that people sometimes make when they sort of compare themselves in this equity theory of motivation. And so you see here, in this next slide, in the first case, if you feel, well, what the outcomes I get are really fair, they're relatively equitable, right? So you're feeling equitably rewarded. Typically what a person will do is maintain their performance and accept comparison as a fair estimate. In other words, yeah, okay, I get it. Everybody around here, if you put in this level of input, you're going to get this outcome. And if I give a little more input, I'll probably get a better outcome, a commensurately better outcome. However, things start to get interesting if you compare yourself to your neighbor and you feel that you are under-rewarded. Because what typically happens is people will do all sorts of things to try to reduce the level of perceived inequity. You can see there, point 1. They may change the inputs by trying harder, or they may get so discouraged that they start slacking off as a result of their mental comparison with their neighbor. Or they may try to change the outcomes and say, you know, I'm putting in more effort than anyone else around here. I deserve better outcomes. I want a raise. Or they may distort the mental ratios by altering their internal perceptions of themselves or of others. They may say, they're getting better outcomes. They must be more talented, or I guess maybe they know the boss, or maybe their kids go to the same school, or maybe the boss doesn't like me. I mean, mentally, you'll try to come up with reasons to explain the inequity, right? You may just decide, point 4, I'm out of here. Forget it. This place is unfair. I'm going to find a better place to work. They leave the situation by quitting the job. Or they may change comparisons by choosing another person to compare themselves to. It says, well, I guess it's not really fair to compare myself to him. I mean, he's actually a rocket scientist. I mean, literally a rocket scientist, and I'm not. So let me find someone who's closer to me in terms of education, experience, etc., to try to compare to. And so, again, that's a mental exercise to try and figure out, is there another extenuating circumstance for this inequity that will explain it away? Because I want the situation to be fair. Now, returning to the slide, you see things really get interesting if you compare yourself to others and internally you feel, honestly, I'm actually over-rewarded. I don't deserve all of these benefits I'm getting. This is like, at one level, right, this is really cool. But at the another level, a deeper level, it nags at you because it still seems inequitable. And that inequity, that unfairness, even though you're on the plus side of the unfairness, will drive you to certain types of behavior. Some of the examples are there. You may either increase or decrease your level of inputs. You may increase them and say, you know what, they're paying me this much. I don't think it's fair. I should give more. Or sometimes you may feel the system is rigged. It's rigged in my favor for some reason, but I'm just going to decrease my inputs. Sometimes you try to rationalize it away and distort the ratios. Or sometimes, in some rare cases, you feel so guilty over being over-rewarded, you actually try to help the other person gain more outcomes in some way, shape, or form because you feel that they're not being treated equitably and fairly. All right, so it's an interesting theory, and it does have some legs because you do see some of these behaviors as people compare themselves to their coworkers. And as a leader, you should understand human beings are comparative creatures. We love to compare ourselves to others. This is going to happen naturally. No matter what you try to do, no matter how you try to constrain it or mitigate it, people love to compare their outcomes with their neighbors' outcomes because they really do want to sense that the organization demonstrates equity and fairness in how it doles out rewards. Hope that makes sense. Well, another couple slides here I want to cover with you when we talk about motivation, and that is there are lots of different ways to motivate people if you find that you need to either promote more desired behaviors or to constrain or discourage undesirable behaviors. Positive reinforcement can be a very powerful tool, as well as occasionally setting up constraints. If you do this kind of behavior, if anyone in this organization does that kind of behavior, they will get written up. If we find you do it again, you are no longer part of this organization. Those should be used sparingly, but they are extremely effective for those kinds of behaviors you absolutely want to prohibit. Typically, other than that, positive reinforcement oftentimes is a better way over the long haul to motivate people, and there is sufficient and more than sufficient data and evidence to back up that statement. The next thing, continuing the topic of using goals to motivate behavior, there is an entire school of management known as management by objectives, and that is a set of procedures involving both managers and their subordinates in setting goals and evaluating progress. So in other words, what MBO really refers to is sitting down with your team and together crafting the objectives that they would find motivating and that also satisfies organizational goals. It's a more of a participative way of setting goals and objectives. Speaking of participative management, you see there that is a full-blown method of increasing job satisfaction by giving employees a voice in the management of their jobs and their company. And so broadening it beyond simply goals and objectives, it is a way to embrace participation, coordination, and contributions of the workforce to help define their very jobs and the very way that management carries out towards objectives. All right, so that is our third of 3 videos dealing with the topic of motivation. All of this content, of course, is covered in the textbook, and we'll see you in the next video.